Okay, so by doing this, he would substitute for each grosser posture one that was subtler. And so too, we don't get a detailed application of the simile, just a broad statement. So too, when the monk gives attention to stilling the thought formation of those thoughts, then those thoughts connected with desire, hatred, and delusion are abandoned and subside. So what does this actually mean in practice? Maybe anybody would like to try to give some ideas? I don't have a fixed, well, I have my own interpretation, but I can't say that my meaning is the definitive and absolutely correct one. Just go ahead and speak, just...
To me, it just seems like you just have to tell yourself to stop. Just stop. It's really quite simple.
It could be that.
Which can work. But it
Yeah.
takes a bit of effort. It's just stop.
Yeah.
What I'm getting out of the whole thing is that...
Yeah, maybe it's best to take this floating microphone.
What I'm getting out of the whole thing is that basically you have to see what works for yourself, you know, in your particular mind state.
Well, that would, it seems, that would work for the choosing which of the methods out of the 5 work for oneself. But how do we understand this method specifically?
For me, it's just bringing an attitude of investigation or questioning to why am I thinking like this? And which can bring a release.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the explanations given in the commentary. When one finds oneself thinking some distracting thoughts, one asks, why am I thinking this? Then one goes, one sort of traces back the chain of thoughts. Why am I thinking that? Why was I thinking that? And as one goes on investigating, then the mind is turned away from that disturbing thought into the series of investigations. And then at a certain point, then one could just drop the investigation and go back to the primary object. So I saw some about it.
There's also the technique that I've been taught of whatever is intruding, to simply label it. And one of the things is thoughts. You just observe thoughts. I mean, it can also be feelings, it can be sounds, whatever. Just observing thoughts.
Okay, that's good. Does somebody else have?
I see there's a why, but there's no answer to the why. First of all, I noticed that. Why am I walking fast? It's just what if. And I see there's a factor of substitution. Instead of walking fast, walking slow. But it never answers why am I. Maybe it's ignore why.
It's actually, the question is somewhat rhetorical. Like, the sense is, since it's the person who's looking for a quiet position, he says, what's the point in walking fast? Not what is my reason for walking fast. Like I have an appointment, doctor's appointment, I have to meet a friend someplace, I have to get to work on time. It's not like that there's an actual reason. But he's saying it's in other words, he's saying it's pointless to be walking so fast. To be quiet and peaceful, I should slow down. Okay, so everybody has given their explanation. My understanding, as I said, it's not fixed, categorically correct one, is that when the mind is giving way to some of these disturbing or distracting thoughts, what one would do would be just to drop the primary object and just watch the thoughts themselves. And so one creates this distance between oneself and the thought and just looks at the thought and watches it. one watches the thoughts, one finds that the thoughts by themselves tend to sort of settle down. The stream of thought tends to settle down until the thoughts aren't occurring anymore. So that the mind is just in a completely observant station, a completely observant poise, looking into itself, watching for thoughts to arise, but because one is taking this observant stance towards one's own thought processes, the thoughts have slowed down. At a certain point, they stop arising. Then one can bring the mind back to the main object. In fact, a very interesting exercise in itself, which is part of the development of Chit Anupassana, contemplation of the mind, is one would begin maybe using a focusing meditation object, like the breath, till one reaches a certain degree of concentration. It doesn't have to be a jhanic state, but just till the mind settles down and becomes fairly concentrated. Then one drops that primary object and just looks at the mind, watches the mind. Sometimes thoughts will arise. One just watches the thought arise and lets it dissolve. Then there'll be periods where one is just in that watching position, watching, but it seems nothing is occurring in the mind. Then maybe some stream of thoughts will come up. Maybe one will even get sort of carried away by the stream of thoughts until one is lost in the labyrinth of thinking. But then one remembers, I'm supposed to watch my mind. And then one goes back to the watching position. And again, the thoughts will slow down, settle down, subside, and become still. Then one will be watching the mind for some time. Then thoughts will come up again and vanish. But just when one is watching the mind, that is a kind of antidote to getting carried away by the stream of thoughts. But again, you experiment, if you want to apply this method, experiment with different methods and see what works, what you find to be effective as an interpretation of this. If you can just stop the mind with the command, stop, that's good. If you want to investigate what is the source of this thought, why am I thinking this thought, what is conditioning this thought, then you can use that approach. Or if you just want to watch the mind and watch the thoughts till the thoughts settle down, use that approach. Okay, now in my way of ordering the 5 methods, I begin with method number 3, then I would go to method number 4, then I would bring in method number 1, then method number 2, then finally we come to method number 5. And this shows that method number 5, that the Buddha recognized that sometimes it's necessary to be forceful. It's not the first method, but sometimes necessary. So, okay, if while he is giving attention to stilling the thought formation of those thoughts, there still arise in him these bad, unwholesome thoughts, connected with desire, with hatred, with delusion, then, with his teeth clenched and his tongue pressed against the roof of his mouth, he should beat down, constrain, and crush mind with mind. Then as he does so, then any evil, unwholesome thoughts connected with desire, hate, and delusion are abandoned in him and subside, and then his mind is steadied internally, brought to stillness, and concentrated. Then comes the simile. Just as a strong man might seize a weaker man by the head or shoulders and beat him down, constrain him, and crush him, so too, again with the teeth clenched and the tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth, one beats down, constrains, and crushes mind with mind. So the Buddha recognizes sometimes it's necessary to use this method. It's not the first approach, not the one that one should bring in immediately when the troublesome thoughts arise, but when all of the other methods prove ineffectual, then one could bring in this kind of direct assault on the mind in order to push away those unwholesome thoughts. Okay, then just to take the concluding paragraph of the sutta. Okay, actually here the Buddha sort of sums up by going through all of the 5 methods again in brief. When the monk is giving attention to some sign, to some object, and owing to that object there arise in him evil, unwholesome thoughts connected with desire, hate, and delusion, then when he gives some other sign connected with what is wholesome, any such evil, unwholesome thoughts are abandoned in him and subside, then his mind is brought to become steadied internally, quieted, brought to singleness and concentrated. Then it's repeated, when he examines the danger in those thoughts, when he tries to forget those thoughts and does not give attention to them, when he gives attention to stilling the thought formation of those thoughts, when he beats down and crushes mind with mind, any such evil, unwholesome thoughts are abandoned, and so on, then this monk is called a master of the courses of thought. He will think whatever thought he wishes to think, and he will not think any thought that he does not wish to think. Okay, now I'm going just to read through the final sentence. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit, he has made an end of suffering. The last sentence implies that this monk has achieved arhatship. Now, from what is contained within the sutta, there's nothing to suggest that the monk has achieved arhatship. And checking the Chinese version of the sutta, the version preserved in the Chinese Tripitaka, I found that that last sentence is not there. Apparently that last sentence was added at a later time in the chain of transmission of the sutta probably because the ones who preserve the suttas, everything has to end with the grand climax. It's like, the hero has to beat the villain and become promoted to be the sheriff of the town, or appointed mayor of the city, or win the love of the beautiful girl and ride off into the distance to live happily ever after. And so probably originally, based on what is found in the sutta itself, the sensible ending is with the statement that this monk will be the master of the courses of thought. He'll think whatever he wants to think and won't think what he doesn't want to think. And in a way that shows the achievement of adhicitta, the higher mind. But in order to justify assigning arhatship, there would have to be some statement showing how he develops insight into the 3 characteristics, and then realizes the 4 noble truths, and then eliminates the asavas, the taints or corruptions of the mind. Okay, so this takes us to the end of the sutta. If there's any questions, then please feel welcome to
Is this on? Yeah. With the crushing mind with mind technique, how does that work if the thoughts that have come up are about assaultiveness and anger? Can you...
Or about what?
Assaultiveness and anger, that as a term.
I think,
Doesn't that give in to them?
well, first, I think when crushing mind with mind, the attitude shouldn't be one of anger. And in my opinion, probably this method is not really intended for dealing with anger. I have to say, from my own experience, it's generally used in dealing with sensual lust. That seems to be its special sphere. Because there sometimes one has to be forceful. And what's interesting about this fifth method, when we read the biography of the Buddha, as he relates it in Sutta, I think it's Sutta number 36, when he mentions that he speaks about his own past experience as an ascetic, when he went off, when he left the palace to become an ascetic. When he set out to meditate, this was the first method that he used, or one of the first methods. So he used at an early stage, he used that forceful method, but then when he later compiled his own strategies for dealing with the mind, he didn't reject that method entirely, but he brought it in as the fifth and last method. It can be useful for sensual lust. It could also be useful for dullness and drowsiness. Sometimes just by making a really firm determination not to give way to this dull, heavy, rigid mind. One could just drive it away through determination. But I'd say for anger and for restlessness, it's not so effective. It's also effective for this, what I would call a state of doubt or perplexity. Sometimes the mind makes a lot of trouble just by raising questions, doubts. Is it this way? Should I go about it that way? What if I do this? What if I do that? If one is asking these questions because it's a matter of sensibly choosing the right strategy or right techniques to use, then it's appropriate to ask those questions. But sometimes the mind just becomes a chatterbox, casting up these questions just as a kind of malign, self-defeating way of pulling one off the track of meditation. Then one just has to make that determination, stop. That's like you. Stop asking those silly questions. Just fix the mind on the object and keep it there. And then that determination can be enough. Maybe it doesn't mean that one goes into perfect samadhi, but it cuts off that stream of senseless questioning and the kind of the chatterbox of questioning thoughts. Did somebody have a question?
Yeah, do you literally clench your teeth, or just something on mental thought? Is that something you physically do, or something that you do in your mind? I'm saying,
yeah, I don't think it's really so necessary to clench the teeth. It's just showing the sort of forceful attitude of mind. But sometimes if one adopts that forceful attitude of mind, maybe naturally the teeth tend to become a little bit clenched. And what is the other one? The teeth clenched and the tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth. I don't think one has to take that too literally.
Okay. That's it. Thanks.
I don't understand why a position is considered grosser than the other position, such as the sitting position is considered grosser than a lying down position, unless it's understood in terms of the movement of the body.
Yeah, I think it's considered by way of the movement of the body.
Okay, so if it's by way of the movement of body, then the fourth methods seem to me to be not a complete objective observance. It seems that one has to tell oneself to do something, like to slow down or to reduce the thoughts.
Yeah, this could be another interpretation of it. Just as the person, this is the point, just as the person who's walking will tell himself at each specific points, stop taking that grosser position and take the subtler, quieter position. So, if when one is observing the thoughts, one could tell oneself, stop thinking these thoughts. Actually, and this would be similar to the method that, your name again? That Drea had recommended, just saying stop. Except here it goes in sequence, rather than just as one command which totally obliterates the stream of thoughts. But probably one just keeps on telling oneself, stop, 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 and then the thoughts slow down until at a certain command they will stop completely. And then one can go back to the main object. Okay, let me take some of these questions off the internet. Okay, is thought formation the same as the mental formation? I think by this he means the aggregate of mental formations. Or is it referring to verbal formation related to attention of thoughts? I mean, nothing really is said very specifically about how this Vitakka Sankhara fits into the scheme of the five aggregates or any of these other schemes. So I think we should just take it in terms of the actual meaning of the words, rather than to try to relate it to other schemes that we meet in the suttas. Just what I would call the activation of thoughts, or the constructing or fabrication of thoughts. Okay, then the second question. These methods call upon energy, or virya. Can other spiritual faculties like faith be used to develop the higher mind? Actually, I wouldn't say that these methods use exclusively energy or effort, but there's actually a combination of factors here. And I say it's a combination of virya, as energy, with mindfulness, which brings greater samadhi or concentration. And so actually, and also with mindfulness, one needs clear comprehension. And so I would say energy, mindfulness, clear comprehension are all working together here. One needs clear comprehension to recognize the thoughts, to be able to identify them. One uses the sati of mindfulness. Excuse me. Let's say one brings in the virya or energy to dispel the unwholesome thoughts, and one brings in the mindfulness to keep the mind focused on its original object, or to attend to the new object that one takes up. So there's a combination of factors that are used here. Okay, third question. If one asks, why am I thinking such, when one is trying to overcome the thought formations, doesn't this cause more discursive thinking to occur instead of remaining attentive to the meditation object? Maybe we could say that this is like using a vaccination to make oneself immune to a disease or to overcome a particular illness. Like the vaccine in itself, if you take it in a large quantity, it's poisonous. But if you take it in a very small quantity, it causes a kind of inner reaction, a mild reaction, that creates immunity to the disease. And so when you ask why to overcome these thought formations, it's using discursive thinking. But it's using the very mild and consciously directed discursive thinking to overcome this distracting and uncontrolled discursive thinking. Or again, it's a little bit like if one gets a big thorn in the skin and one wants to remove it, one might use a needle to push out the thorn. Normally you wouldn't stick oneself with a needle, but if one uses the needle carefully in a directed way, you could push out, say it's a poisonous thorn that would deposit some poison into the skin that would cause a rash. So one wants to get rid of it, one uses the needle to push it out. Okay, how do other methods to overcome distracting thoughts, like counting the breaths, chanting a mantra, or switching to metta, loving-kindness meditation, fit into the 5 methods given in this sutta? Okay, things like counting the breaths or the metta meditation, they can actually be the beginning meditation subject. And then the distracting thoughts could build up based on those meditation subjects. But one could also use them as methods for counteracting distracting thoughts. For example, as I explained earlier at the beginning of the class, counting the breaths can be a method of, if the mind is tending to stray, to become overrun by restlessness, then when one assigns oneself this task of counting the breaths, then one constantly has to be aware of the number. And so the mind becomes, you're giving the mind a little toy to play with, a sort of game to play. So it's like challenging oneself. You have to be attentive to the number. And so if the mind strays, then one will recognize it, and one has to go back to 1, it's the penalty, and start over till one gets to 10 down to 1. And then this helps to keep the mind back on the meditation subject. Then the metta meditation can be used to overcome ill will and anger. It's the direct antidote to ill will and anger. Chanting the mantra, in the methods that I've been trained in, we don't actually use the mantra, but if that method works, it becomes, again, it's a method of having some object on which to focus the mind so it doesn't get distracted. Okay, maybe at this time we'll take a break, and then we'll come back after lunch at 12 o'clock, maybe a few minutes after, for a question and answer discussion period. Then I should mention that it's at 2 o'clock, Heidi? Yes. There will be a service, interfaith prayer service today for the victims of the earthquake in Haiti and also the earthquake in Chile last week. So if anybody wishes to stay for this, you're welcome to join in and participate. And the prayer service that's organized under the auspices of BAUS, the Buddhist Association for the United States. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits from meditation, speaking on the Dhamma, discussing the Dhamma. We share the merits with the deities, the dragon spirits, the Bhutas and fear spirits, asking them to rejoice in these merits, to protect the Dhamma, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Well, recite in Pali. You can join in if you'd like. Akasata chabumanta punyantang anumoditva shivam rakantu sasanam akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva shivam rakantu desanam akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva shivam rakantu mam param etavatachalam hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavatachalam hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe buddhanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavatachalam hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe sadanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavagupadhaya vichitato etantare satakaya papana rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pavuchantu pusantu vibhuti